A very warm welcome to the CNBC Africa special broadcast as we begin our series on the road to the annual meetings of the World Economic Forum in Davos. I'm Kenneth Igbomor, and in the course of the week, we'll also have conversations from Eastern and Southern Africa on our Road to Davos series. And by this time next week, the 50th annual meetings of the World Economic Forum will be underway in Davos, Switzerland between the 21st and 24th of January. Over 3,000 participants across the world will gather to explore this year's theme, which is Stakeholders for a Cohesive and Sustainable World. Also, to coincide with the 50th anniversary, the World Economic Forum has launched a new Davos Manifesto, which are a set of ethical principles to guide companies in the age of the fourth industrial revolution. According to Klaus Schwab, the founder and executive chairman of the forum, the manifesto states that companies should pay their fair share of taxes, show zero tolerance for corruption, uphold human rights throughout their global supply chains, and advocate for a competitive level playing field. My guest today, Frank Aigbogu, is the publisher and CEO of BusinessDay Media, and he joins me to put all of this in perspective as we focus on the topic, stakeholder capitalism in Africa. Thank you so much for joining me today,
Pleasure,
Frank. Okay, now looking at that topic, stakeholder capitalism in Africa, you know, for what hits you when you listen to that and looking at recent happenings across Africa?
Well, I mean, the key thing is, if you look around the world, there is still no better alternative to capitalism. And with everything, you would imagine that there will be issues. People will have issues. There will be feelings here and there. There is, in Africa, the real practical question of inclusion. Many people in Africa feel the economy is developing outside of them. They are mere passengers in the economic development that Africa has seen. And that is generating discontent, restlessness, and making people question the virtue of capitalism. Yeah, so I think it makes sense.
Yeah, but when you look at how, you know, the fourth industrial revolution, how that has played out so far, you think that has kind of helped to bridge that divide, you know, between the Western nations and developing countries?
I think to some extent, yes. To the extent that technology allows societies and allows economies to leapfrog, to that extent has that gap between Africa and the developed world is closing. Then, of course, inside Africa, the gap between the haves and the have-nots also closing. But it is not closing as faster and as quickly as people who feel left out want to say.
But when you look at stakeholder capitalism and you look at the corporate world in Africa, do you think our companies are doing enough to, you know, better represent, you know, that they are meeting the interest of all the stakeholders involved?
I don't think one can get to the point where you say they are doing enough. They are coping. They can do much better. But don't forget that except, of course, in South Africa, the private sector in the rest of Africa is still developing. It's still emerging. It's still evolving. There aren't many matured companies in the rest of Africa, as you will see, for instance, in Europe and perhaps in South Africa as well. And that evolution will bring with it better practices, better efficiency, and a greater sense for what happens in the larger society.
Yeah, because you look at developed countries, they already have things going for them. Africa was still dealing with issues like power, for example. And, you know, and I can imagine a country trying to close the gap in power, and they just want power. Then probably they want to think about, you know, if it's coal or if it's a better way for the planet. But, you know, how do you find a balance, you know, in trying to meet development needs and also being sustainable in view?
That is the challenge with countries that are still developing. In fact, it would be the challenge that China would throw at the rest of the world, for instance. But China is relentlessly building coal power plants and with very little thought for what that means for global carbon emission, for instance. But I think in Africa, what you're seeing is, I was reading a very decent document by ESCOM in South Africa last month. They proposed to shut down 15,000 megawatts of coal power plants or coal-powered electricity and build 40,000 megawatts of clean energy. So Africa has responded, but South Africa can do that because of where they are. Better capitalized. They have been at this for a very long time. If you come to a country like Nigeria, where the gap between power that is available and what we need is so huge, there isn't so much concern yet about carbon emission and about a balance between clean energy and coal. But Nigeria has never done coal, so perhaps that's a good one. And most of our power today is a bit of hydro, but largely from thermal gas-fired plants, which is cleaner than coal. And I imagine that will be the path for the rest of Africa for the next five years at least. Yes.
All right, it's interesting that this year, the World Economic Forum is going to be marking 50th anniversary. 50 years of Davos coming in there. What has been that impact so far for you from where you sit?
I got a copy of the almost 400-page book commemorating the 50th anniversary, which was personally signed by Klaus and sent out, which I got 3 days ago, and I've been reading it. What strikes me is how an individual, just a single thought with the European, Management Forum, built a global behemoth that has now become perhaps the most reputable platform for global engagement. So the first thing you must say is it has created a platform for engagement.
All right, creating a platform for engagement.
Yes,
okay.
And you're engaging on very big issues, whether it's about climate change, whether it's about the trade tensions between America and China, for instance, whether it's about globalization and the feelings of globalization, whether it's about technology, and of course the fourth industrial revolution that you've alluded to. So, and then each time, every page of it provides some very decent chronicling of the work that has been done over the years, of the issues that have, because what you find, because it holds first thing in the year, it tends to be the platform where ideas are tested, both by politicians and by business leaders. And not only tested, but also refined before they take it to the field for implementation. So I think Davos has really helped to bring the world closer, bring people closer. When I looked at messages from people like Ronald Reagan, messages from Edward Heath, I looked at messages from from Nelson Mandela, messages from the former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and I was really thrilled. I was excited. These things can never be done in a day,
All right, but coming with this as well is the new manifesto that's coming on board.
Yes.
We saw the earlier manifesto from 1973, and now we're seeing this new manifesto come on board as to mark the 50th anniversary, talking about getting companies to do more to pay
more taxes,
fair taxes.
Yeah.
Talking about zero, tolerance for corruption.
Yes.
Better
labor practices.
Yeah, better labor practices,
Yes.
and advocating for a more competitive level
Yes.
field.
Yeah.
Where does Africa sit in all of this?
Again, what you are now beginning to see in Africa is that countries are moving at different pace. You're seeing different tracks. Some countries are moving faster than others. Some are slower in their movement. But clearly, I believe that WEF hammering on companies paying fairer taxes resonates very, very well in Africa, and especially in countries like Nigeria, where governments are revenue short and are looking for ways to make more money. So I think that makes a lot of sense, but it is also a responsibility for government to do what it has to do to interface better with companies, with the private sector. For instance, you have the very big issue in Nigeria, where the bigger portion of the economy is informal, and you are not even capturing it as well. So government has to find very creative ways of bringing the informal sector and mainstreaming the informal sector to ensure that the informal sector plays its own fair share, both in revenue generation, in better practices, in the work that we all must do to create a more level playing field for everybody.
Yeah, because the other thing that kind of sticks out for me as well, looking at the manifesto, is being able to uphold the human rights, especially with labor practices. You look at companies that are struggling. We still have cases of child labor in the cocoa industry across West Africa, which the industry is trying to tackle. We have very varied, minimum wage in Nigeria. It's still quite low, and countries and companies alike are still struggling to make this. But how can we get better outcomes on this front?
I mean, the key thing you mentioned minimum wage in Nigeria, but of course you know that the private sector pays far higher than the government minimum wage. So the problem with minimum wage in Nigeria is not so much a private sector problem. It's more of a government problem. Even what you now have that's been legislated on at 30,000, state governments are saying, resisting that they cannot pay. I haven't had so much of a resistance from the private sector because they're at higher levels anyway. I think this calls for a better engagement between governments in Africa and their business leaders to ensure that they both speak from the same page or both sing from the same page. There has to be better understanding of how the private sector in Africa is evolving. I believe that government needs to get out of the way for private businesses to thrive. We need to take out a lot of the restrictions that still hold down the private sector in Nigeria. Government needs to be very creative in policy, in regulation. And if you look around the world, the move is towards reducing tax rates. The government in Nigeria did that with the finance bill that the president signed only 2 days ago, especially for the small and medium-sized companies. I guess that at some point it may need to focus on 30%, and that is just net. You're not adding education tax and other taxes for oil companies, NDDC levies, for instance. So there has to be a way that government approaches that, bring more people into the tax bracket, and then expand the total collection annually.
All right, then I needed to hold that thought for a second while we take a quick break. I've been speaking to Frank Aigbogu. He's the publisher and CEO of BusinessDay Media on the show, and we will continue the rest of the conversations after the break. Welcome back. If you're just joining us on this special coverage, as we build up to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the forum will mark its 50th anniversary. Frank Aigbogu, the publisher and CEO of BusinessDay Media, has been my guest for this conversation so far. Before we left off, Frank, we're talking about the Davos Manifesto. We touched on a little on taxes and then labor issues. But now I'd like to get into the area of advocating for a competitive level playing field across. And I'm thinking about looking at Africa now. We're going to get the AFCFTA on board, and countries really need to get their ducks in a row as that is concerned. What would you say has been the traction so far for you?
Well, I think AFTA has been received very enthusiastically in a larger part of the continent. They see it as a tool for growing their economies. Nigeria has been slow in getting to that point, but I think we are now at a point where there is no going back in Nigeria. So it's a question of how you focus, and thankfully, you've had these ratings on ease of doing business on the World Bank ratings over the years that help to break down what the issues are in terms of competitiveness. So every country, and even in a country in Nigeria, we're now beginning to think about sub-regional competitiveness rankings. So you know where the roadblocks are. You know what the issues are. You know why you are not competitive. In Nigeria, you can count them on your fingers: power, infrastructure, the quality of education, and workforce, health, and all those issues. So I think that what countries, especially Nigeria, must do now is to begin to enable teams look at these critical pillars of competitiveness and say to Nigeria, not just to government, both government and private sector, this is what we must do to become competitive. If we don't do that, then we just become a dumping ground. I know that there's been an attempt to deal with the issue of country of origin in terms of goods that are coming in into African countries. But you know that smugglers, they always will find a way. So the only thing that I believe that can help us is to begin to reduce unattractiveness. Cost of power needs to go down drastically in Nigeria. You need to be able to build better infrastructure, and I think government needs to get out of the idea that it alone can build infrastructure. You need to bring in private capital, let them toll bridges, toll roads. You need to concession even the running of the rail that the government is building. You need to concession it. The Nigerian Railway Corporation is too inefficient, too inept, lethargic. It cannot be trusted to manage these billion-dollar rail projects that we're building around the country. So for me, I think those are the concerns.
All right, but still on trade, though, the world is still, trying to, ward off the effects of the trade war that we saw happen last year, which was the key issue around trade last year. And then we're starting the year with geopolitical tensions still taking center stage. With what played out between what's playing out between the United States and Iran. But how can African countries better manage the geopolitical shocks that could happen from tensions around the world?
Well, I mean, thankfully, even the one that you referred to, there's been significant de-escalation after the unfortunate downing of the Ukrainian jet. But I'm not sure anyone is talking now of a war, arising. So that's good. Hopefully, the temperature will cool down. But I think in Africa, one thing you must say is that there are fewer wars in Africa today than there has ever been over the years. And I think that puts Africa in a good place to begin. Now, we need to begin to create platforms for engagement, I must stress that, between government and private sector. We need to begin to align strategies for developing and leveraging technology, to build companies that can provide jobs, create wealth for people, and that ultimately leads to higher taxes for government. We need better regulation. I think Africa must just get to the point where walking is not good enough. It must be running. For me, I think that's what we must do. Investing in education, investing in good healthcare, investing in infrastructure. Typically in countries like Nigeria, building platforms to private sector that allows significant investment into the power sector, for instance.
Yeah, but you mentioned something very interesting, which is the area of jobs and skills,
Yes.
because it's very critical.
Yeah.
The continent is going to add on another billion people over the next decade, and how we position to take advantage of that, it's very, very critical. But looking at the conversation we're having here today, talking about stakeholder capitalism, and then going on the theme of the World Economic Forum for this year, which is cohesive and stakeholders for a cohesive and sustainable world. How better can we prepare for this youth bulge?
Clearly, I mean, the team is great. When you talk about cohesiveness, it means that there is a sense that the level of inclusion or inclusiveness is not good enough. Now, if you look back, one way that fast-tracked people over the years is good quality education. It helps to provide a level playing field for everybody. It doesn't matter from what home you have come. When you all meet in college and university, you begin to think alike, and when you graduate, the difference between the wealthy and not so wealthy as they start begins to shrink. So for me, the key thing is investing in good quality education. And I'm happy to say that that is happening in a lot of African countries. Unfortunately, we aren't seeing that happen in a large country like Nigeria. I've seen rankings lately of university education in countries where they don't even mention Nigeria, unfortunately. So I think for me, that's the key focus, and then, of course, build infrastructure that allows people unhindered movement. And then, hopefully, upon that, businesses will be created and goods can move freely as well.
Right, but then, tracking the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals is also paramount in this conversation that we're having here today.
Sure.
Looking at how we've come so far since they were announced, and then it's just a decade till the deadline. How would you say African countries have progressed? And how can we, for the ones who are lagging behind, how can we better get those countries to at least meet some of those development goals?
Again, I think it's a mixed bag. You'll see some countries that have done slightly better. You take a country like Ghana, for instance, and see how well it's done in terms of what it has delivered in healthcare. Certainly a better health insurance environment, better HIV transmission from a pregnant mother to children. They've nailed those things. Infant mortality rates are coming down. So there are some bright spots around Africa. Again, my view is there needs to be better investment into these sectors, and I believe that a better way to attract that investment is a more creative engagement with the private sector. Governments in Africa just don't have the cash, but there is a lot of private capital that is idle. I think it's unfortunate that the world is swimming in liquidity and a lot of Africans are suffering the question of illiquidity. It's a mismatch and we need to close it. And if we do that with good policy, then Africa will be ready to compete.
Yeah, because talking about Africa competing, the importance of technology in getting African enterprises, to be performing at the level that we should be performing is very important. Talking about taking advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. But are we seeing innovative models being created here to help drive this? So I'm talking about this because yes, the fact that when I look at the figures, coming out from the last year, how African startups performed in getting capital from across the world. Yeah, Nigeria, Kenya performed reasonably well, but then I think a lot still needs to be done if we're going to compare with our global peers.
I agree, but that's a good start. Whatever way you look at it, you need the capital. So if owners of capital around the world are beginning to notice us, I think that's good. And if we don't mess up by closing the door, it means that more of that capital will come in. You have a large market, but we are beginning to build a good pool of talented young people that are technology savvy and going into these new technology businesses that are being created, or they themselves are creating one. And I think that's what we need to do. Africa needs to do that. Technology is the greatest tool for leapfrogging for economies around the world today. So we won't have an example, we won't have an excuse not to promote inward investment into our technology ecosystem. Nigeria is doing well there. The reason why you are not seeing the impact that you want to see is because we are only starting. It's just like a drop in the ocean. But if we maintain the momentum, I think that the kind of impact that you're speaking about will begin to happen.
All right, then. Thank you so much for your time today, Frank. Very interesting conversations, leading up to the World Economic Forums in Davos next week. I've been speaking to Frank Aigbogu. He's the publisher and CEO of BusinessDay Media. And that's all for today's coverage of the West Africa edition of the Road to the World Economic Forum in Davos next week. A big thank you to my guest for making it today. And I'm Kenneth Igbomor, and have a wonderful day.